today I want to kind of put together the two different sets of skills that we've been going over for the last week or so. And that is, that's going to be simplifying radicals, and complex numbers. Okay, so the first thing you need to know is if you didn't watch the video from yesterday, you need to go back and watch the video from yesterday. The square root of -1 is I. Okay, so if we said, what's the square root of -9? Again, the same thing we have been doing. Let's split this. This is the square root of 9 times the square root of -1. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of -1, I just told you, is I. Okay, so I said, what is the square root of -9? It is 3I. If I said, what is the square root of -25? Again, let's split this down. Square root of 25 times the square root of -1. Square root of 25 is 5. Square root of -1 is I. So if I say, what's the square root of -25? It is 5I. Okay? So again, by defining this as the square root of -1 is equal to I, we make these things kind of possible. Okay? So today I just want to kind of combine that with some skills we've gone through, and so some not perfect squares, some other things as well. All right, so a couple more. If I said, hey, what's the square root of -75? Okay, now again, you guys should know from a couple days ago, the square root of 75, I break that down, find a perfect square. 25 goes into 75, and it goes in 3 times, right? 25 times 3 makes 75, and 25 is a perfect square. So this is a 5 radical 3. If I throw this negative sign in front of it, all you really need to do is go and put a little I in there. 5I times the square root of 3. Okay, so again, just to show you that, let's break this down. This is 25 times 3, and again, times -1. 25 times 3 is 75. 75 times -1, -75. Okay, now let's go ahead and find this out. This is 5. This stays how it is. And the square root of -1 is I. 5 times square root of 3 times I. 5I times radical 3. If you were good at what we were doing last week, and you just add this little negative sign in there, okay, all you need to do is throw an I on the outside, okay, because that will account for this square root of I that we factored out, okay? So what if I said, let me clear the ink. No, okay. What if I said, what is the square root of -490? Okay, now don't freak out, okay? You guys know some numbers like that. Now, first of all, if we want to think about this, that is going to be 49, which is a perfect square, times 10. And again, to account for the negative, square root of -1, which we know is going to be I. Square root of 49, 7. Square root of 10 is as simple as it gets. And square root of -1 is I. Let's just go ahead and put that together in nice form. 7 times I times the square root of 10. So again, just to show you guys, if you were good with this last week, right, if you knew that this was, you know, radical 49, radical 10, 7, radical 10, again, if I throw a negative sign in there, all I need to do is throw an I out here. Okay? All right, so again, if I said, what's the square root of -80? You would go ahead and probably say, all right, well, what's a perfect square that goes into -80? Well, that would be, I don't know, so let's go square root of 16 times the square root of 5 times the square root of -1. Square root of 16 is 4. Square root of -1 is I. Square root of 5 is square root of 5. Okay? If you got something that said the square root of -17, okay, when you get a number like this, there's no perfect squares that go into 17. Again, all you need to do, throw an I on the outside and leave the square root of 17. Okay? Again, why does that happen? If I say what's the square root of -17, I'm breaking that down into square root of -1, the square root of 17, I, radical 17. So again, if you're okay with this, yeah, go ahead and just throw that I on the outside. You're just getting rid of that square root of -1 and leaving it as it can right there. Okay. The only other things you might see, let's go through. If they throw a negative sign on the outside, negative square root of negative 100. Well, again, we know that the square root of 100 is 10, right? So if I said, what's the square root of negative 100? Again, that's the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 100 with a negative sign up front, right? Square root of negative 1 is going to be I. Square root of 100 is going to be 10. So I have negative I times 10. So what does that become? Negative 10I. Okay? So no big deal again. So probably keep some parentheses around here. Right? Again, that negative just gets applied. Remember, whenever we have a negative sign up front, that's really just a negative 1 as a coefficient. So do whatever's in here, then just multiply your answer by a negative 1. Okay? If I said negative square root of negative 125. Well, again, what do we know? First of all, let's say negative I. Let's just go ahead and do that. 125. Again, just get rid of that negative. Okay, and that'll leave you kind of an easier problem. What do we got? Square root of 25 times the square root of 5. So negative I. Square root of 25 is 5. Okay, and again, that's just a little bit of housekeeping. We don't write I5, we write negative 5I. Remember, it's all multiplication, so we can write it in whatever order we want. Okay? So again, like I said, there's a few different ways to look at these same problems. Again, if you wanted to do it kind of the long way, right? A negative, okay, times what? The square root of 25 times the square root of 5 times the square root of negative 1, right? 25 times 5 is 125 times negative 1 is negative 125. Square root of 25 is 5. Square root of 5 is the square root of 5, and the square root of negative 1 is I. And again, little housekeeping. 5I times radical 5. Good? If I said, what's the negative square root of negative 6? Well, there are no perfect squares that go into 6. So what are we going to say? This is going to be square root of 6 times square root of negative 1 with a negative on the outside. Again, square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 6 is 6. So again, we write coefficients, i's, and some variables right there. All right, and the only other thing they could do is something like this. If I said, what is 20 plus the square root of negative 20? Again, what's a perfect square that goes in here? Square root of 20 is going to be, what would I say, a square root of 4 times the square root of 5 times the square root of negative 1. So what is that going to be? I 2 to the square root of 4 and radical 5. 2I times radical 5. Okay, you can't add these things together because you can't evaluate these. So you leave it just like that. This is what we call A plus BI form. Okay, and that's not yours. And one more. If I said, hey, what's negative 19 minus the square root of negative 19? Again, the square root of negative 19, it stays that way. All you need to do is bring out the I. Okay, there's no perfect squares that come to 19. So, like I said, I'm going to give you guys some assignments to do, give it a try, and that's about it. Thank you.